Hello, I'm Nate, aka B-Tier Mutineer, and as part of my B-Tier guides for Dragon Age Origins, I'm going to give you an in-depth guide of the Mage class. I of course have Mage builds for an Arcane Warrior Warden or the two Mage Companions, but I want to take you through all of the stats, spells, gear, and important elements of the class so that you can make your own builds and feel more comfortable playing a Mage in Origins. As a note before we begin, I used the mod Dane's Fixes, which I've mentioned in many of my videos as a must-have, since it fixes many bugs related to combat and mechanics, and various features in the game that were not properly implemented, such as some of the item stats. Because of this, I might have a slightly different opinion on certain spells and items, since Dane's Fixes changes them and possibly makes them more or less viable than before. I highly recommend the mod, at least the basic bug fixes and some of the tweaks, though I also like some of the extra things included by the mod author. Let's start with the basics of the Mage class, explaining what a Mage can do, what types of build archetypes there are, and what stats mages generally care about. The Mage is, in my opinion, the most powerful class in Dragon Age Origins. Most of the time, they will stay at range and use mana to cast spells that damage, crowd control, debuff enemies, or buff and heal themselves and their allies. Other than casting spells, mages wield staves with which they shoot magical basic attacks that automatically hit unless blocked by the environment. The basic attacks are not a strength of the mage, since they do relatively little damage, especially compared to the damage done by spells. Mages are powerful because they are extremely versatile, and they also have more spells to choose from compared to the fighting abilities that warriors and rogues can use, only 16 per weapon style, and some class-specific abilities. Mages have a total of 68 spells to choose from, and that's before they unlock 2 specializations. There are, generally speaking, 2 main build archetypes, the Damager and the Support. The Damager focuses on spells that damage enemies, and the Support uses spells that heal and buff allies. However, these archetypes aren't so cut and dry. For example, even a Damager mage can spend 1 point to learn the heal spell and use it to restore the HP of injured allies. The Support could put a few points into some damaging spells so that they can supplement damage where necessary. Often you can successfully combine both damage and support if you know which spells are worth picking up. I personally don't ever make a fully Damager or fully Support mage build, since optimizing things isn't really my jam, and it ends up giving me an overall worse gameplay experience. If you look at the tactical presets in the game, you can see that there are also some other archetypes the devs thought of named Debilitator and Controller. I don't think these tactical presets are done very well, but at least they get you thinking about these other possible avenues of focus for your mage. You could mainly focus on crowd controlling enemies with spells that freeze, stun, paralyze, petrify, slow, or otherwise affect enemy's ability to move and take action. Or you could focus on lowering enemy attack, defense, and resistances while combining them with heavily damaging spells to combo with the debuffs. The game also makes a difference between a healer and a supporter, but I personally think that if the mage uses healing spells and buffs on their allies, that's a support mage. No need to split it into 2 categories. You can find out what spells each preset is meant to use on the Dragon Age wiki. The link is in the description. Who knows, you may find some interesting tactic there that you want to use for yourself. There are also the 4 specializations a mage can choose from. Out of 4, you'll be able to choose 2. You get 1 specialization point at level 7, and the second one at level 14. Specializations can radically change the way you play your mage, or just act as a supporting set of spells for your existing build. I'll talk in more detail about the specializations when we talk about all of the spells, but know that the 4 are Arcane Warrior, Blood Mage, Shapeshifter, and Spirit Healer. For now, let's move on to the stats mages find useful. You want to keep this in mind for when you can allocate attribute points when leveling, as well as when you're looking for better gear to equip. Magic is a main attribute that mages want to increase. Higher level spells can have magic requirements to unlock, and in general, magic improves everything a mage does because it directly increases the mage's spell power trait. Spell power is the stat that increases the damage and effectiveness of most mage spells, and the damage you can do with mage staff basic attacks. You can increase your spell power by increasing your magic attribute, as well as getting direct bonuses to spell power from gear, passive bonuses, and a couple of sustained spells. Mana is another important stat, since it determines how many spells a mage can cast before they need to drink a lyrium potion or otherwise wait for their mana to regenerate. You can improve your mana pool by putting points into the willpower attribute, as well as getting gear with bonuses to willpower or mana. Generally, gear that has plus stamina bonuses will turn into plus mana for a mage. Mana regeneration is another very important stat. It's mainly improved by gear that has mana regeneration bonuses, though items that have a stamina regeneration bonus will generally transfer that bonus to the mage's mana regeneration instead. This is especially useful for Arcane Warriors who can use heavy armors and melee weapons which can have such bonuses. The other stat that can be useful for mages is to get gear that has bonuses to the elemental type of damage their main damaging spells deal: fire, cold, electricity, or spirit. Nature damage isn't really applicable since most spells don't deal nature damage, and nature damage has the most enemies that are resistant and immune to it. If your mage is an Arcane Warrior, dexterity bonuses could be useful since it increases both your attack and defense scores, which are very much needed if you're fighting in melee and are acting as a tank of sorts. Of course, bonuses to attack and defense from gear and various spells are also great to help your Arcane Warrior land their attacks and be harder to hit. Normally, mages don't really care about attack or defense. Their spells just hit unless the enemy resists them with spell resistance or another resistance check. The basic attacks from staves also automatically hit unless they get blocked by the environment. And in terms of defense, if your mage is a regular ranged one, you should have at least one tank in your party who keeps the aggression of enemies onto themselves, thus protecting your mage from being attacked. Plus, mages also have access to various spells that can get them out of situations when they're being attacked in melee by a lot of enemies. However, if you're an Arcane Warrior and utilize the specialization to make yourself into a powerful melee fighter, your attack and defense scores do matter. If you're a Blood Mage, you will be using your health pool as a resource to cast spells from instead of your mana. So of course, in that case, you want to find gear that increases your health or constitution, as well as your health regeneration in combat. I'm not really an expert in this, however, as I don't use this specialization myself most of the time, but in general, if you have a larger health pool, that means you can cast more spells by using your HP before you have to turn off the blood magic sustained or have to wait to regenerate your health. There are also ways to affect your health regen through a spell, which we'll talk about later. Now that you know the basics of the mage class, I'm going to take you through all of the spells mages have access to. First, the regular spells that all mages can learn, and then the spells you can unlock after choosing a certain specialization. Each spell category is going to be timestamped, so feel free to skip around and only watch the parts that contain the spells you're interested in. In the Arcane category, there are 2 spells, a single target damaging one and a sustained one, and 2 passive bonuses. Arcane Bolt shoots a spirited damage bolt at a target. It has long range, a small cost, and short cooldown. The long range can often allow the mage to stay outside of the enemy's perception range and fire at them without the enemy attacking back. I think this is a great spell to have on any mage, no matter the build, because spirit damage is good against most enemies, and having cheap long range damage is useful. You can enhance the damage of Arcane Bolt by making enemies vulnerable to spirit damage through the use of Hexes, which I'll talk about in the Entropy category. Arcane Shield is a sustained spell that increases the mage's defense. I wouldn't use this spell on a regular mage, since you should have a tank or 2 in your party who will keep enemies from attacking you. However, it's useful for an Arcane Warrior who wants to go up in melee and act as a fighter tank. This spell's defense bonus scales with spell power, so it gets even better as you level up and increase your spell power. Staff Focus is a passive that grants a bonus to the damage done by staff basic attacks. You mainly want a mage to be casting spells and not doing basic staff attacks. However, sometimes when they run out of mana, you don't necessarily need them to drink a Lyrium potion, so this damage bonus is decent. A staff's basic attack damage also increases with spell power, so your mage may do a significant amount of damage later on in the game if they have high spell power. Arcane Mastery is a passive that grants a +5 bonus to spell power. Since it's such an important stat, I think this passive is great to unlock if you have the points to spare, but it's not a high priority since you can get bonuses to spell power from a lot of other sources. In the Primal category, there are a total of 16 spells, 4 each for Fire, Ice, Earth, and Lightning. Unlike what you may think, Earth spells don't deal nature damage because in DAO, nature damage relates to poison, venom, acid, not earth or stone related damage. That's physical. In the Fire tree, there are 3 area of effect spells and 1 weapon enchantment. Flame Blast damages enemies in a cone in front of you with fire damage. It's a strong spell, and fire damage is great to have versus Darkspawn and Undead. In my opinion, it's the best damaging cone spell due to so many enemies being weak to fire throughout the game. Flaming Weapons is a weapon enchantment that enhances the damage of all melee weapons in your party, your dog and shale included, with extra fire damage. I always unlock this weapon enchantment on my mages because Darkspawn and Undead are the most common enemies you'll face throughout the game, and they're weak to fire. Fireball is mostly what you'd expect, a large AoE damaging spell that deals fire damage to all creatures in an area, and also has a chance to knock down targets in its blast radius. Very useful if you can either cast it in an area where none of your allies are affected, or you could also cast it where one of your tanks is, as long as that tank is immune to knockdown and wouldn't be bothered by the fire damage. I prefer to only use it at the start of a fight when my allies are far enough away to not be hit by the fire damage. Inferno summons a huge column of swirling flame, dealing constant fire damage to all creatures in the area. Just like with Fireball, I prefer to use this in areas that only have enemies. It does good damage, but friendly fire is a downside. The Earth Tree contains utility spells. Rock Armor is a sustained spell that increases the caster's armor. Unless you're an Arcane Warrior and want to be fighting enemies in melee, I don't recommend using this. Most mages want to be far away from enemies, and if anyone attacks them, you should have your tanks quickly redirect the enemy aggression away from the mage. For Arcane Warriors, the armor bonus is great because it increases with spell power, and you're likely to be wearing heavy armor or something with a big armor bonus, so your armor is going to be very high. Stone Fist hurls a stone projectile at a target. It has a chance to knock the target down, and it can also shatter enemies that have been petrified or frozen. This is one of my favorite spells because of its chance to shatter enemies. Earthquake is an annoying spell that causes the earth in an area to shake and knock targets down and reduce their speed. This is horrible to inflict upon your party members, and in my opinion it just doesn't do enough to enemies to be worth it. However, you may still find it worth unlocking this spell even if you don't use it because of the final spell in this tree. Petrify turns a target into stone unless it passes a physical resistance check. While petrified, you also have a chance to shatter the target with a critical hit or a spell like Stone Fist. The Ice Tree has one single target damage spell, 2 area of effect spells, and 1 weapon enchantment. Winter's Grasp deals cold damage to a target and has a chance to freeze it. It's one of my favorite spells due to the fact that it can freeze enemies and thus make it possible to shatter them. Even without shattering, it's a cheap spell that does a good amount of damage and can CC enemies. Frost Weapons is a weapon enchantment that enhances the damage of all melee weapons in your party, your dog and shell included, with extra cold damage. It's not as useful as flaming weapons because most enemies aren't weak to cold and undead are resistant to it. However, it's worth picking up if you want to get the next spell on the list. Cone of Cold damages enemies in a cone in front of you with cold damage and has a chance to freeze them. This spell is extremely useful if you have a large amount of melee enemies you need to CC, such as the werewolves in the Brazilian forest and ruins. While the cold damage is not as good as fire, the freeze effect is very powerful and can of course enable shattering. Blizzard summons an ice storm that deals continuous cold damage to everyone in the area and slows their movement speed, with the possibility to freeze or slip and be knocked down. Creatures in the area also get a defense and fire resistance bonus, since they are harder to hit due to the storm, and ice protects against fire. Due to the slow and slip effects, I personally don't use Blizzard unless I'm targeting only enemies because it gets really annoying to see your own party members falling on their asses every few seconds. If you only have tanks as part of your front line and they are immune to knockdown and have high physical resistance, then you could use Blizzard without issues. The Lightning Tree has one single target damage spell and 3 area of effect spells. Do note that lightning damage drains some of the target's stamina if the creature uses stamina, but the stamina drain effect isn't all that amazing to be honest. Lightning fires a bolt of lightning at the target, dealing electricity damage. It's a good single target damaging spell since only abominations, steel golems, and the archdemon are resistant to lightning. I like to have the lightning spell available since it's cheap, has a relatively low cooldown, and does a solid amount of damage. But it's not as high priority as other spells since no enemy type is weak to electricity damage per se. Shock damages enemies in a cone in front of you with electricity damage. Personally, I don't bother unlocking anything past lightning since spells dealing other elements tend to be better. Fire for use against darkspawn and undead, and ice for the freeze effect. Tempest summons a lightning storm that deals constant electricity damage to everyone in the area. There is one particular case this can be used, which is casting Tempest on creatures or locations not in your line of sight. You can, for some reason, cast this spell in a different room through walls. So if you feel like cheesing your way through certain encounters, this could be useful, although you could just play on easy and follow advice from my builds and other guides and you'd be completely fine without cheesy strategies. Chain Lightning emits a bolt of lightning that deals electricity damage on a target, then forks, sending smaller bolts that jump to nearby targets which fork again. Each fork does less damage than the previous one. If there are lots of creatures clustered together, this spell can do a lot of damage. With 3 or less targets, it's not really worth it, especially because it has a conjuration time of 2 seconds, so it's possible the enemies you're meaning to hit with it will not be in the same position when the spell releases. This spell can be annoying when an enemy targets your melee characters with it because your melee fighters will be likely engaged with a group of enemies, so the lightning will bounce between many targets dealing a lot of damage. However, due to the longer conjuration time and no additional effects, I don't recommend using it yourself. It can be dangerous to use it if your melee party members are near the enemies you want to target, because you could accidentally end up killing them too. The Creation category includes spells that can heal and buff allies, crowd control enemies, and some utility spells. It includes 16 spells, 4 each in Healing, Heroism, Glyphs, and Nature. The Healing Tree has spells that relate to healing allies' HP or boosting their mana or stamina regeneration. It has 4 spells, 3 single target, and 1 that targets the entire party. Heal does what it says on the tin. It heals an ally within range for a moderate amount. The caster can also target themselves. This is one of the first spells I unlock on any mage because keeping your health up is super important in fights, not just to stay alive, but also because at certain thresholds, enemies may use some really nasty abilities against you. I absolutely recommend having this spell on any mage. It's an essential one. I can't say the same thing about the other 3 spells in this tree. I recommend skipping them unless you want to pick up Regeneration for a Blood Mage. Rejuvenate grants an ally a short boost to mana or stamina regeneration. During combat, this essentially amounts to 40 points of mana or stamina over time, which I just don't think is that amazing. It also can't be cast on self. Regeneration grants an ally a short boost to health regeneration. Combat health regeneration is capped at 20 per tick, and the duration of the spell is fixed. That means this spell will always heal a total of 100 health over 10 seconds. However, due to the weird mechanics, blood magic can't reduce the healing of health regen at all. So if you want to make your blood mage really powerful, you can unlock this spell to keep your mage topped up on health as you receive far more than you expend by casting the spell. Mass Rejuvenation increases mana or stamina regeneration for the entire party for 15 seconds. In combat, that means it regenerates an extra 35 points or so. I think it's far better to just get gear that has mana or stamina regen on the characters who need it, rather than use Rejuvenate or Mass Rejuvenation because they don't generate enough resource to be worth it, and also have long cooldowns. The Heroism tree includes 4 spells that buff allies' offensive and defensive capabilities. 3 of them are single target, and 1 is sustained. Heroic Offense increases an ally's attack score for 20 seconds. The bonus is affected by spell power. This spell is quite good in the early and mid-game when your party members may not be able to hit enemies as easily due to having a lower attack score, but in my opinion it falls off later on once you've leveled up enough and gotten gear with various bonuses to attack, either direct or indirect. Heroic Aura increases an ally's missile deflection score by 30 points for 20 seconds. This spell is not affected by spell power, having a fixed bonus. This is very useful to cast on my party's tank whenever I'm in a fight with a lot of archers, but it's obviously quite situational as sometimes you may not encounter enough archers for it to be worth casting. Heroic Defense grants an ally bonuses to defense and all elemental resistances for 20 seconds, but also gives them a 5% fatigue penalty. The bonuses are affected by spell power. This is a great spell to cast on your tank. The defense is useful, and the elemental resistances obviously help against enemies dealing various types of elemental damage, whether spellcasters, creatures dealing nature damage, demons and abominations, etc. The fatigue bonus is not that big of a deal, especially for a tank who mostly just cares about taunting enemies and doesn't have a shit ton of abilities to spam. Haste is one of the most beloved spells by the DAO community, and for good reason. It's a sustained spell that increases the movement speed as well as attack speed of all your allies, while having a -5 attack penalty for the team and a -3 mana regeneration and combat penalty for the caster. It's a bit bugged in the vanilla version in regards to aim speed, but if you have Dane's fixes, you have no more bugs to worry about. Everyone likes attacking faster, whether melee or ranged, so you can't go wrong with haste. The only important thing to remember is the -3 mana regeneration penalty in combat for the caster. You need to have bonuses to mana regen from gear and other sources to make sure your mage can keep this spell up. The Glyphs tree is comprised of glyph spells that are inscribed on the ground, which have a detrimental effect upon an enemy that crosses its bounds for the first time, or a constant effect upon creatures standing within its bounds. Personally, I don't bother with glyphs even though they can be strong in combination with one another, because there's too much to set up and I don't have the patience. Glyph of Paralysis is inscribed on the ground or can be cast directly where an enemy is standing, and paralyzes the first enemy that crosses its perimeter, for up to 10 seconds depending on enemy rank, unless the opponent passes a physical resistance check versus the caster's spell power. For some reason, Glyph of Paralysis are considered traps and thus can be disarmed by rogues in your party. For the same reason, such a glyph can still affect a character even if they have 100% spell resistance. It can hit multiple enemies at once if you cast it over an area with enemies already in it, and it can also be cast through barriers or behind a closed door. This spell is part of the Paralysis Explosion combo, which is created by casting both Glyph of Paralysis and Glyph of Repulsion. Glyph of Warding is inscribed on the ground and bestows nearby allies +30 defense, +50 mental resistance, and +30 missile deflection, which stacks with defense being in total +60. It lasts for 20 seconds. This glyph is large enough to fit all your party members inside its area. Even at the beginning of the game, it will make your party immune to all ranged attacks, although Scattershot will still damage you because it bypasses the defense rating. It stacks with itself, so multiple mages casting the glyph on top of itself will double all the bonuses. It's a very powerful defensive buff, but it does require your party members to be inside its area to benefit from it. If you anticipate your allies will be standing in that one spot for a long time, perhaps fighting some kind of more or less stationary melee enemy, then it's a good idea to put this glyph down. Glyph of Repulsion knocks back and down anyone entering its radius unless the target passes a physical resistance check against the caster's spell power. The target is also slowed for 20 seconds. This glyph can be used in conjunction with Glyph of Paralysis to create the powerful but dangerous Paralysis Explosion combo, which I'll discuss later. Glyph of Neutralization is inscribed on the ground and neutralizes all magic, dispels all effects, drains all mana, and prevents spellcasting or mana regeneration within its bounds. While under the influence of the glyph, targets are applied to the effects of anti-magic ward, rendering them nearly immune to hostile magic. I honestly have no idea when you would want to use this glyph, as I myself have never used it. Perhaps as a way to neutralize an enemy spellcaster? But then, unless they're stuck in place, I imagine that they would move out of the glyph's area, unless the enemy AI isn't smart enough to do that. I'm not sure. The Nature Tree includes 3 utility spells and 1 damaging spells that deals nature damage, which is extremely rare and not very useful since many enemies resist or are immune to nature damage. Spell Wisp is a sustained spell that grants the caster a small bonus to spell power as long as it's active. It's a pretty cheap spell to sustain, and it takes into consideration all the spell power bonuses the mage has when the spell is activated. If your mage has a big enough mana pool, this is a good spell to keep sustained to increase your spell power. I don't think it's required by any means, but it is useful. Grease summons a slick pool that slows anyone who walks on it, as well as causing them to slip unless they pass a physical resistance check. I don't like using this spell because it mainly just makes your own party members run slower and possibly slip. If you want to CC enemies, things that freeze or stun are much better. If the grease pool is set on fire, it also burns for a time, causing the grease fire effect. I'll discuss the official spell combinations later, but just know that this one isn't worth it. Spell Bloom creates an energizing bloom in an area that grants anyone nearby, including enemies, a bonus to mana regeneration for 20 seconds. It honestly regenerates far too little mana to be worth it, even if you're regenerating it for multiple mage party members. I don't recommend picking it up. Stinging Swarm sends a swarm of biting insects on a target, dealing a fairly large amount of nature damage over a period of 10 seconds. If the target dies before the duration ends, the insects will jump to a nearby enemy and the duration resets to 10 seconds. As cool as this spell looks, it's not really useful in the majority of cases due to doing nature damage, as most enemies resist or are even immune to nature. However, if you inflict hexes upon enemies that give them minuses to resistances, including nature, and you also have bonuses to nature damage on your mage's gear, the damage of the spell can be increased significantly, even versus nature-resistant enemies, as long as they are not truly immune. Due to the fact that this spell is last in a list of not-so-great spells, I personally don't bother unlocking it, although I know some people recommend having this spell against the Archdemon, who is far more resistant to other types of damage than nature. I've never found the Archdemon all that scary though, since you can just damage it with the ballistas on the map, as well as have various allies you call upon to damage it for you. Next up, the Spirit category, which includes spells that can affect enemies' bodies, minds, and magic. It has 16 spells, 4 each in Soul Warding, Mana Drain, Necromancy, and Telekinesis. The Soul Warding tree is all about anti-magic effects. It has 3 activated spells and 1 sustained spell. Personally, I have never ever used any of these spells, especially because the Templar has the Cleanse Area ability if I need to dispel any magic nearby. Spell Shield is a sustained spell that gives a 75% bonus to spell resistance to the caster. However, whenever they are hit by a hostile spell effect, it drains some of their mana. Once all mana has been depleted, the shield collapses. In my opinion, your mages should generally not be targeted by enemy spellcasters, since your tank or tanks should be keeping enemy aggression away from your squishy targets, so you shouldn't need to use this. Dispel Magic removes all dispellable effects from a specific target with friendly fire possible. This spell can be useful to cast on an ally who has been affected by a nasty hostile spell, such as Curse of Mortality. Don't really know if there's any spell effect you'd want to remove from enemies, since this doesn't dispel anti-magic ward. In all honesty, if you want to keep one of your allies from dying by way of Curse of Mortality, I would much rather use the Force Field spell on them, which makes them immune to all damage for the duration. Anti-Magic Ward protects an ally against all spells and spell effects, beneficial or hostile, for 10 seconds. In the vanilla game, the ward unfortunately still lets through some spell effects such as freezing, slowing, or the immobilization of Force Field and Crushing Prison. However, if you have Dane's Fixes, it actually solves this problem, making the spell far more useful. For example, you could use this spell on a party member who is surrounded by enemies, and then target that area with an AoE spell like Fireball or Inferno or even Blizzard, while protecting your ally from the damage and other effects. Anti-Magic Burst eliminates all dispellable magic effects in the area, with friendly fire possible. This will clear persistent area of effects created by AoE spells. However, it will not dispel Glyph of Neutralization and can't go through Anti-Magic Ward. This seems to me very similar to the Templar's Cleanse Area, and I use that extremely rarely as it is. Again, I simply think there are far more useful spells to use if you want to protect an ally, such as Force Field, or if you want to neutralize an enemy, such as literally any CC spell. The Mana Drain tree is related to improving the mage's spell power and draining or negatively affecting enemy spellcasters' mana. The first 2 spells are quite useless, or at least I haven't found a way to use them. The last 2 spells are really good, however. Mana Drain absorbs a small amount of mana from an enemy spellcaster. It doesn't cost any mana, so you'll always be able to absorb something as long as the spellcaster still has mana. However, this is only really useful at the beginning of the fight while the enemy mage still has mana, as they don't use lyrium potions to restore it and thus regenerate it quite slowly. Additionally, it can be difficult to figure out which enemies use mana. Of course, humanoid spellcasters using staves are obvious, but for example, some demons and abominations also use mana rather than stamina. Unless you're looking to unlock the final 2 spells in this tree, I don't recommend picking this up. Mana Cleanse makes the caster use up some mana to nullify a certain amount of mana from enemies in the area. In the vanilla game, this spell actually does the opposite of what the description says, replenishing the target's mana by the specified amount instead of draining it. This can be exploited if you want to increase an enemy's mana to increase the mana clash damage, but otherwise it's useless in its vanilla state. If you're using Dane's Fixes, this spell will function as it should. However, even if you have Dane's Fixes, I don't think this spell is worth it, as instead of reducing an enemy's mana, you either want to use Mana Clash to deal a huge amount of damage while they still have full or close to full mana, or else use a high damage or CC spell to neutralize them. Spell Might is a sustained spell that increases the caster's spell power. It increases spell power by double the amount compared to Spell Wisp, but it does also have a -4 mana regeneration penalty. I personally prefer to only use Spell Wisp for the spell power increase, as the mana regen penalty of Spell Might is very annoying, and I'd much rather keep up other spells that give such a penalty, like Haste or the Arcane Warrior's Shimmering Shield. Mana Clash is the star of this tree, affecting an area around the caster which drains enemy spellcasters completely of their mana, and deals spirit damage to them proportional to the amount of mana they lost. This can very often outright kill enemy spellcasters if you cast it at the beginning of a fight when they are at full or almost full mana. The Necromancy tree involves inflicting corrosive spirit effects upon enemies, drawing power from dead enemies, and summoning skeletons from enemy corpses. Other than occasionally using the first spell, I personally don't bother with this tree. Walking Bomb magically infects a target with a corrosive poison that deals spirit damage for 20 seconds. If the target dies while the effect is still active, it explodes, harming all nearby targets with physical damage. A target can't be affected by both this and virulent Walking Bomb at the same time. Shattering an enemy who has Walking Bomb active will detonate the bomb immediately. Death Siphon is a sustained spell that drains nearby dead enemies to restore the caster's mana. Honestly, I've never found any situations in which there were enough enemy corpses for me to want to keep this spell active and feel it was worth it. Additionally, Death Siphon and Death Magic are mutually exclusive, as they both target enemy corpses. Virulent Walking Bomb magically infects a target with corrosive poison that deals spirit damage for 20 seconds, just like Walking Bomb. If the target dies while the effect is still active, it explodes, physically damaging nearby targets, and having a chance to infect them with this effect. A target can be affected by both the virulent and regular version of Walking Bomb at the same time. Animate Dead summons a skeleton minion from the corpse of an enemy to fight alongside the party for as long as the spell is sustained, although as a puppet of the caster it will not use any talents or spells without specific instruction. This is an interesting spell, because a corpse wielding dual weapons will become a rogue, and a corpse wielding a staff will become a mage, otherwise it'll be a warrior. There are various talents or spells the reanimated skeleton can have, chosen at random from a number of presets. If you want your skeleton minion to be of higher level and have access to additional abilities, you can create the Advanced Reanimation combo by having Spell Might active when you cast Animate Dead. The skeleton draws a lot of threat from nearby enemies when initially summoned. It also has the natural traits of an undead: immunity to nature, 75% cold resistance, -25% fire resistance, aka weakness, and immunity to charm and sleep effects. This spell does not work in the Fade, and the minion will be unsummoned if either it or the caster is hit by a Dispel Magic effect. Reanimated warriors are great off-tanks since they have high health and all have the Threaten ability regardless of their weapon set. Skeleton mages may sound powerful, but they don't usually have very good spells and have a low mana pool. Dual-wielding rogue skellies have the highest potential damage if you position them behind enemies so that they backstab them. Rogue skellies also have the ability to pick locks and disarm traps. Finally, the Telekinesis tree includes a variety of spells that have very different effects from one another, so I can't really describe them generally. However, I have found all of these spells to be useful. Mind Blast projects a wave of telekinetic force around the caster that stuns enemies in the sphere. This is a great spell to use when you're dealing with a large group of enemies that are clustered together, or if you have 2 or more enemies attacking your mage in melee and you want to stun them to run away. This spell clears all threat except for distance-based threat, but if you want your mage to get rid of enemies attacking them, use Mind Blast to stun them and then run away to keep them from being likely to attack you when they shake off the stun. I love having this spell as a defensive option, but I sometimes also use it offensively by walking up to a group of enemies my melee characters are engaged with and stun the enemies to make them easier to get rid of. Force Field erects a telekinetic barrier around the target who becomes completely immune to damage for the duration of the spell, but is also immobilized. Friendly Fire is possible, and it's actually great to cast this on your allies when they're being affected by a nasty enemy ability, such as the Curse of Mortality spell, an Ogre's Grab, the Overwhelm ability, or being tossed around by a dragon. You can also dispel Crushing Prison from an ally with Force Field, although this creates the Shockwave spell combo which damages and knocks down nearby targets, so you may not want to do this if many party members are nearby. I also use this spell offensively sometimes, mainly against a powerful enemy spellcaster, to stop them in their tracks for a while, especially if they also have minions you need to take care of. Telekinetic Weapons is a weapon enchantment that grants an armor penetration bonus to all the melee weapons in the party, including Dog and Shale. If a character is dual wielding, the bonus is added twice, once for each hand. Personally, I just prefer using flaming weapons, since most of the time they do a good amount of fire damage due to the weakness to fire of Darkspawn and Undead. However, if you are fighting enemies that are resistant to fire or otherwise enemies who have a high armor score such as elites or bosses, it may be useful to switch to telekinetic weapons to increase the amount of physical damage your melee characters can do to such highly armored enemies. Crushing Prison encloses the target in a collapsing cage of telekinetic force, immobilizing them and dealing spirit damage for the duration. In the vanilla version, it can't immobilize bosses, But if you have one of the balance/mechanic tweaks from Dane's fixes, it will have the chance to do so, as it's strange that only Crushing Prison can't affect bosses, while other, arguably stronger disabling spells can. This is one of my favorite spells. I really enjoyed the visual effect, and also the strong immobilized CC and spirited damage. As I mentioned earlier, it can be combined with Force Field to create the Shockwave combo, but make sure to not have many party members nearby when doing this, as they will all be knocked down. The final category is Entropy, which is comprised of spells that drain enemies' life force, resistances, and crowd control them. It has 16 spells, 4 each, in Chains of Entropy, Hexes, Mental Contamination, and Entropic Mortality. Entropy is probably my favorite spell school in terms of vibes and visual. Very cool looking. The Chains of Entropy tree includes spells that crowd control enemies and hinder their movement speed, attack, and defense. There are 3 activated spells and 1 sustained. Weakness inflicts penalties of -10 to the attack and defense of a target, as well as possibly reducing its movement speed unless it passes a physical resistance check. It's not a bad spell early, but it falls off later, as the -10 isn't as meaningful. Paralyze saps a target's energy, paralyzing it for a duration unless it passes a physical resistance check, in which case its movement speed is reduced instead. As is the case with any spell that can disable enemies, Paralyze is great. Enemy spellcasters, elites, and bosses are the best targets for the spell. Miasma is a sustained spell that radiates an aura of weakness around the caster, which grants penalties of -10 to the attack and defense of nearby enemies, as well as a movement speed penalty unless they pass a physical resistance check. In my opinion, this is a better spell than Weakness because it's sustained and can affect multiple targets at the same time. However, the mage has to be quite close to enemies for this to be worth sustaining, so it's best for an Arcane Warrior tank. Arcane Warriors often struggle with low attack, so the defense debuff on enemies is particularly good. Mass Paralysis paralyzes all hostile targets in the area for a short time unless they pass a physical resistance check, in which case their movement speed is reduced instead. The thing about Mass Paralysis is that it can be resisted, whereas the Paralysis Explosion can be cast in such a way that targets won't resist it. It's still a great group CC spell, but I find that in most fights I really just need to disable a few key enemies like elites and spellcasters, or otherwise if I need to CC multiple enemies, I prefer using something like Cone of Cold for the added possibility of shattering. The Hexes tree includes various single target spells that affect an enemy's resistances, attacks, and defenses, though one of them can also spread to other nearby enemies. Vulnerability Hex inflicts penalties to a target's elemental resistances as well as mental resistance. It's particularly good to cast this to try to make enemies vulnerable to various elements so that you can do more damage to them. If your mage has a large amount of spell power, you can reach the cap of -100% resistance, which means the elemental damage you do to an enemy is doubled. If enemies possess true immunity to an element, you can't bypass that with this penalty, but since they will be made vulnerable to all other elements, you can find something to target them with. Because Shale's damage is largely elemental based due to her weapon turning her regular damage into damage of that particular element, this spell as well as Affliction Hex will benefit her. You can combine Vulnerability Hex with Drain Life to get the improved Drain combo, which is really just an improved version of Drain Life. Nothing special, but good if you're going to cast Vulnerability Hex anyway. Affliction Hex inflicts penalties to all elemental resistances on the target, as well as all other enemies nearby. But be careful who you cast it on, as the aura around the target only persists as long as it's alive. The penalties stack with Vulnerability Hex, as well as with itself if multiple Affliction Hexes are cast on different targets. If you want to use mainly elemental damage to defeat enemies, like if you have multiple mages, shale, and/or many elemental runes in your melee weapons, these first 2 hexes are important as they will make enemies much easier to kill. Misdirection Hex causes all of the regular hits of a target to become misses, and their critical hits to become normal hits. Do note that this doesn't affect certain special abilities such as an Ogre's Ram attack, because those are automatic hits that don't need to confirm the attack result. I personally haven't found much reason to use this hex, as I much prefer focusing on buffing allies or debuffing enemies' defenses and resistances to kill them faster. Misdirection Hex is more annoying if enemies cast it on one of your melee characters if you can't dispel the effect, since they'll be useless for a while. Death Hex causes every normal hit the target receives to become a critical hit. Due to the fact that this is the last hex in the tree, as well as the fact it just makes attacks crit on a target, I personally don't use it. However, there is an interesting strategy to use it with an archer's rapid shot or a dual wielder's dual striking modes, since they make the allies' attacks have 0% chance to crit, and so Death Hex's crit chance is 100% minus the character's current crit percentage. This means the lower your base crit, the more likely you are to crit on the target affected by Death Hex. There's also a spell combo called Entropic Death that can be activated by casting Death Hex and Death Cloud in order to deal a huge amount of spirit damage instantly to the target. The Mental Contamination tree has spells that affect enemies' minds negatively with debuff, crowd control, and damaging effects. 2 of them are single target and the other 2 are AoE spells. In general, I don't use them even though they can be powerful simply due to the fact that they are a bit too situational for my tastes. and can't easily be used on all or most enemy types. Disorient inflicts a penalty of -5 to the target's attack and defense scores. This spell can't be resisted, but it has a very small effect, and thus it's not really great, especially in the late game. Horror forces a target to cower in fear, unable to move unless it passes a mental resistance check. Targets already asleep when this spell is cast can't resist its effect and take massive spirit damage through the Nightmare spell combo if you cast Horror and Sleep together on a target. Keep in mind that all sorts of demons and undead, as well as various bosses, are completely immune to sleep effects, so this really mostly works on humanoid, darkspawn, and some animal enemies. In my opinion, it's quite a fun spell, especially in combination with sleep, but it has a super short range which makes your mage quite vulnerable. I think it's fine to cast Horror as a defensive option if a melee enemy is attacking your mage, but otherwise it puts you in a disadvantageous position to cast it offensively. There are other spells that disable enemies that can be cast from farther away. Sleep is an AoE spell that causes all targets within the area to fall asleep unless they pass a mental resistance check. The asleep enemies will wake up if they are hit. As I mentioned, sleeping enemies can't resist the Horror spell causing the Nightmare combo, but many enemies are immune to sleep effects, so you can only use this on humanoid, darkspawn, and animal enemies. Waking Nightmare is an AoE spell that causes hostile targets in the area to be trapped in a waking nightmare unless they pass a mental resistance check. They are either stunned, attack other enemies, or become the caster's ally for the duration of the effect. Enemies already asleep cannot resist this effect. The Entropic Mortality tree drains life force from enemies, with some of the spells healing the caster as well. 2 are single target, and 2 are AoE spells. Drain Life drains health from a target with spirit damage and heals the caster for the same amount. You can cause the improved Drain spell combo by casting Vulnerability Hex and then Drain Life on a target, causing the spell to do extra damage and thus also heal the caster for more HP. It's one of my favorite spells because it's cheap, it gives the caster sustain through the health drain, and it does spirit damage, which is a good damage type to have. Death Magic is a sustained spell that drains life force from any nearby dead enemies to heal the caster. As with Death Siphon, I just don't think it's really worth using this spell because you won't have that many enemies that die near you for the healing to matter. However, you may want to unlock this spell in order to gain access to the next one. Curse of Mortality is one of the most powerful spells in the entire game in my opinion because it curses a target to take continuous spirit damage and be unable to heal. Now, to be fair, this effect is far more deadly against your own party since you usually have the ability to use healing magic or potions, whereas only some enemies have access to some forms of healing through life drain abilities or healing spells. It's best to immediately dispel this effect from your ally or else cast Force Field on them to make them immune to all damage. The Dwarven Regicide Antidote that you can get a recipe for from a side quest in Orzammar's Royal Palace will also remove it. There are some cases where it's absolutely worth using this spell against enemies, mainly against spellcasters, either regular mages who can have the heal spell, or blood mages who can use blood sacrifice on their underlings to heal themselves. Under the effects of Curse of Mortality, these types of enemies will be unable to heal and thus be much easier to kill. Finally, Death Cloud summons a cloud of entropic energy in an area that deals continuous spirit damage to anyone who enters the area. Friendly fire is possible. The Entropic Death spell combo can be triggered by having a target be afflicted by Death Hex and enter the Death Cloud, dispelling the hex and receiving a huge amount of spirit damage instantly. I do quite like this spell, even if it does some damage to your allies as well, because other than the damage, it doesn't have other negative effects upon your party members, and you can keep them alive quite easily with health poultices and healing magic. Plus, you can cause entropic death on a high priority enemy you want to quickly dispatch. These were all the basic spells that mages have access to. Quite a lot to choose from, though I do feel that some are a bit too situational or weak, and thus aren't necessarily worth picking up, unless they unlock a stronger spell later in the tree that you really want. But I think you get a lot of freedom to create a build that not only works well mechanically, but also fits the character you want to play thematically. Now we move on to the specialization and the spells they offer. There are 4 specializations: Arcane Warrior, Blood Mage, Shapeshifter, and Spirit Healer. I will admit, I am heavily biased towards Spirit Healer, and to a lesser extent Arcane Warrior, even though lots of people love the Blood Mage. I will start with the ugly duckling of the bunch, the Shapeshifter. Unfortunately, as cool as it seems to turn into various animal shapes, the ugly duckling does not at any point turn into a swan. This specialization sucks. You have access to 4 abilities: Spider Shape, Bear Shape, Flying Swarm, and Master Shapeshifter. The Master Shapeshifter ability is a passive that improves the previous 3 shapes, but they're still not good enough. It takes a long time to transform into one of the 3 shapes you have access to. You don't have access to anything other than a few basic abilities of that animal shape, and you aren't even strong or all that durable in animal form. Morrigan starts out with this specialization, and while it makes sense for her lore-wise, it's just a waste of a bunch of points unfortunately. You could probably play around with this on easy difficulty for the cool factor of turning into animals, or better yet, find a mod that improves it. There could have been a lot of ways to make this actually cool and interesting, such as adding a cat form or other small critter form you can turn into in order to use it as a form of stealth for mages and bypass enemy encounters. Or if they wanted it to be purely combat focused, I would have loved a drake or dragon form instead of flying swarm, something with more power that would also just look very cool. I haven't played around with Shapeshifter mods, so I have no idea what modders have done for the specialization, but if you're interested in making this viable, I highly recommend looking into mods. Next up, the Blood Mage. I personally don't use this specialization in most of my playthroughs, mainly for role-playing, as I generally don't have a mage character who is dumb enough to use blood magic and put themselves at an even higher risk of demonic possession. I know that demonic possession isn't a thing in the game mechanics for the protagonist or companions, but for role-playing reasons, I don't really see a reason for any of my characters to dabble in blood magic. Mage spells are already powerful enough to get whatever you want, and lyrium potions are plentiful even if you don't use any exploits. Anyway, this specialization gives you access first and foremost to the blood magic sustained, which you have to keep sustained in order to cast any of the other 3 activated spells: Blood Sacrifice, Blood Wound, and Blood Control. The other huge reason I don't use this specialization is actually due to the blood magic sustained, because it uses health instead of mana to cast spells, and it annoys me that I have to keep a close eye on my mage's health, which isn't only drained by casting magic, but can also be affected by enemies' attacks and spells. Plus, blood magic also makes your healing abilities 90% less effective, which is really annoying as I always like to have my mages heal their allies even if they're mostly a damager. Though I admit, researching all of the spells for this video has made me curious to try a blood mage who uses regeneration plus other health regen bonuses to keep their health topped up. Blood Sacrifice drains life from an ally and heals the caster for double the amount. The healing amount is not affected by the penalty of blood magic. I totally understand why enemy blood mages can do this, because to them their NPC underlings don't really matter, but having this spell for the Warden or any of the mage companions kind of sends mixed signals. Who in their right mind would want to stick around someone who is sucking the life out of them? Role-playing reasons aside, I also don't know why you'd want to drain life from your allies, since that just means they'll need to use a health poultice or be healed by a non-blood mage spellcaster companion. In my opinion, Blood Sacrifice isn't really worth it, since there are better ways to heal yourself as a blood mage, such as using the regeneration spell or otherwise having gear with health regen bonuses such as the Life Giver Ring. Blood Wound is an AoE spell that inflicts a large amount of spirit damage to all hostile targets within the area. The targets also stand twitching, unable to move unless they pass a physical resistance check. Creatures without blood, aka demons, undead, and golems, are immune. I think this spell is very powerful as it both severely damages enemies and has the chance to immobilize them. It essentially combines a lot of the great effects from other spells, the immobilization of mass paralysis but without the long casting time, the damage over time paralysis similar to Crushing Prison but affecting multiple targets, it deals spirit damage which few enemies are resistant to, and considering its power, it has quite a short cooldown. Another really huge feature of this spell that makes it better than other AoE plus CC spells is that it will not inflict friendly fire. The only shortcomings are that it only affects enemies with blood, and it can only be cast while blood magic is active. I assume that the people who enjoy the Blood Mage specialization mostly love Blood Wound, because I can totally see why you would want to unlock this spell. Extremely powerful. Blood Control turns the target into an ally of the caster for an amount of time unless it passes a mental resistance check, and if the target resists, it still takes great spirit damage from the manipulation of its blood. As before, creatures without blood are immune. I don't like this spell as much as Blood Wound because it's a single target effect, and if the target dies while it's your ally, you don't get any XP from its death. One thing that's interesting about this is that casting this spell on the last standing enemy in battle counts as ending combat, allowing you to save and do things you couldn't otherwise do in battle if you need to. Not really sure where this would be useful, but it's something. On the whole, the Blood Mage specialization is the edgy one, and it doesn't surprise me that it's also a very min-maxy specialization since it has Blood Wound, which is insanely powerful. If you want to have an easier time playing a Blood Mage, there is another stat that is important to have on one of your gear pieces, the Improves Blood Magic property. This will reduce the health cost of your spells by 25%, thus making it easier for you to cast more spells and not run out of health, especially if you combine this with a high health regen from your gear, or at least from the regeneration spell. The Improves Blood Magic property doesn't stack with itself, however, so just have one item with this property equipped. The Arcane Warrior is a beloved specialization from Origins that unfortunately disappeared from later games and was replaced in Inquisition by the Knight Enchanter, which I don't think is as cool because it just makes you have some melee options instead of truly changing you into a heavily armored battle mage. The Arcane Warrior allows the mage to wield melee weapons and wear heavier armors by using their magic attribute instead of strength to satisfy equipment requirements. Combat magic has the passive bonus of being able to satisfy strength requirements on gear with your magic attribute, but it also is a sustained mode that increases your attack score and uses spell power instead of strength to determine weapon damage. The higher your spell power, the higher your attack bonus will be. The sustained is also enhanced by unlocking Aura of Might and Fate Shroud. Speaking of, Aura of Might is a passive that grants additional bonuses of +5 attack and damage and +10 defense while the Arcane Warrior has combat magic active. These bonuses are great, in particular the attack and defense, as Arcane Warriors tend to struggle with those. Shimmering Shield is a sustained spell that grants +15 armor, +75% to all elemental resistances, and +75 mental and physical resistance. However, it has a mana regeneration penalty of -10, making it quite difficult to keep up. It is possible to completely offset the mana regen penalty if you choose the correct equipment and skills. Combine any of Wade's superior dragon armor sets that give +2 regen, the Andrew's Blessing Belt for another +2, Kaelin's arm set made up of Mayark's Blade and Kaelin's Shield for a +5.75, as well as the second rank of combat training that grants +0.5 regen. These numbers are for the PC version. On consoles, the regen amounts are twice as high except for Kaelin's arms, so you have more options for gear. Personally, if I make one of my mages an Arcane Warrior, I absolutely get them as much extra mana regen as possible to use Shimmering Shield, because it's an extremely powerful defensive spell and I enjoy having my mage be pretty much invincible on the field, with great stats from gear, various defensive buffs from Shimmering Shield, Rock Armor, Arcane Shield, and temporary buffs from the Creation Tree if needed. Finally, Fade Shroud is a passive that grants a +1 mana regen bonus in both combat and exploration, and a +25% chance to dodge attacks while combat magic is active. Chance to dodge is always amazing to have, and it's also great to get some extra mana regen for Shimmering Shield and whatever else you may want to keep sustained. A few notes on gear for the Arcane Warrior. If you aren't planning on using Shimmering Shield because you think the -10 mana regen penalty is too much to build your entire character around, then I recommend looking for good defensive stats on your armor and accessories, such as defense, chance to dodge, plus armor, health regen, and constitution, spell resistance, physical resistance, and perhaps elemental resistances. If I'm not using Shimmering Shield, for armor I usually like to go either for the Armor of Diligence set or use the Reaper's Vestments robes and combine them with some strong gloves and boots. In terms of Arcane Warrior weapons, I still recommend you go for a weapon and shield. If not Kaelin's arm set, then I like the Spellweaver Longsword, an Arcane Warrior restricted weapon, and one of 3 shields, Eamon's Shield, Champion's Shield, or Fade Wall. The Spirit Healer specialization is in my opinion the best one, as even if you're making a mostly damaging mage, you can expend a single point into the tree to unlock Group Heal and keep your party healthy. Group Heal is a party-wide healing spell that restores quite a large amount of healing to all your party members. I absolutely unlocked this spell in nearly all my playthroughs because it's just too good, and I don't like carrying hundreds of health poultices with me. I like to use Group Heal when multiple allies are under 60% or so health, or if one of my allies is very low and others are also at least a little bit hurt, or heal is on cooldown. If you think your allies are likely to die often in fights, Revival is great because it resurrects allies in a small sphere AoE so that they can rejoin the fight. This spell does have a cooldown of 2 minutes, so it's likely you won't be able to cast it multiple times throughout a fight, although in some cases it may be possible if it drags on for a very long time. Do also note that the revived allies will be low on health, so either make them use poultices or use a healing spell on them to bring their HP back up. The revived party members will also have the injury from being knocked unconscious, so either use an injury kit or use the cleansing aura sustained while near them to remove their injury. Life Ward places a protective ward on an ally that lasts 1 minute and automatically restores health when the ally's HP drops below 33%, consuming the ward. This spell can be a bit annoying to deal with when enemies cast it on their own allies, but otherwise I don't necessarily find it as useful for your own party members, since using heal, group heal, or a health poultice is in my opinion better as it's an instant effect and you don't have to expend mana for something that may or may not trigger during that 1 minute duration. Finally, Cleansing Aura is a sustained spell that restores health every few seconds to allies within 10 meters of the caster, as well as curing allies within 5 meters of the caster of any injuries. Allies further than 5 meters away will not have injuries cured, and the heal will be decreased by distance. This mode has a mana regeneration penalty of -10, similar to Shimmering Shield. Unlike Shimmering Shield, however, I don't recommend you keep this active at all times because the healing isn't that amazing. If you want to pick this spell up, I only recommend it for its injury curing utility, since after a combat ends, if any of your allies got knocked unconscious, you can cluster them next to your mage, cast Cleansing Aura for a few seconds to cure the injury, and then turn the spell off. It's really just something to use instead of injury kits or instead of traveling to camp. Nice to have, but not essential. There may be 2 situations where you may want to use Cleansing Aura for its healing, although you should likely ensure that you have enough mana regen to keep it sustained for some time. The attack at nightfall in Redcliffe Village and the final battle. This spell can actually heal allied NPCs, not part of your main party, thus reducing the casualty rate drastically. Together with heal and carefully taunting or CCing enemies to stop them from damaging the villagers, you can keep the villagers alive more easily in Redcliffe if you have the sustained active. However, I don't know how many people would go late enough to Redcliffe that they'd have Cleansing Aura unlocked, since it can only be unlocked at level 14. Still, I think it's useful to know you can use it in this way to keep allied NPCs alive more easily. There are 3 other spells I want to mention in a special category, since they're not part of the basic spells everyone has access to. First is a Vessel of the Spirit ability that is a sustained spell Wynn unlocks at some point as you travel with her in your party. Wynn can activate this to disorient all targets within a 2.5 meter radius, restore 50% of her maximum health and mana instantly, and get a spell power and mana regeneration bonus. However, this spell does automatically deactivate after a while, and Wynn is stunned for 10 seconds and gets minus 20 defense, minus 10 attack, and minus 40% movement speed for 30 seconds. You can augment the spell by doing Wynn's personal quest and getting the amulet Anerant's token. Wynn must either have it equipped or it must be in your inventory. If someone else is wearing the token, Vessel of the Spirit will not be augmented by it. The augmented effects of the spell are as follows. All targets within a 5 meter radius are knocked down unless they pass a physical resistance check, in which case they are disoriented instead, with friendly fire possible. Restore 100% of maximum health and mana instantly, a larger spell power and mana regen bonus, and Wynn is no longer stunned when the spell deactivates, although the other penalties still apply. Vessel of the Spirit is quite a powerful sustained spell for Wynn, especially if she has an Anerant's token so that she doesn't get stunned anymore. So if you use Wynn in your party, which I don't, then you'll likely find this spell extremely useful to augment Wynn's abilities, in particular her spell power, and of course restore her health and mana. I don't really recommend using the non-augmented version, however, since being taken out of the battle for 10 seconds really sucks. The other 2 spells I want to discuss are ones your Warden can unlock by drinking the alchemical concoction during the Warden's Keep DLC, Dark Sustenance and Bloody Grasp. Dark Sustenance lets the mage self-inflict a wound of minus 40 HP to draw power from their tainted blood, converting the health into plus 100 mana. It has a 1 minute cooldown, and it takes approximately 3 seconds for the casting animation to complete and the health to mana conversion to occur. Unfortunately, with lesser lyrium potions restoring around the same amount of mana at no cost of health, consumption animation of 1 second, dirt cheap ingredients, and a much shorter cooldown, there is just no reason to ever use Dark Sustenance. They really should have made it more powerful, perhaps let you restore 50% of your mana like Wynn does with Vessel of the Spirit, and also have the animation only take 1 second rather than 3. Anyway, as it stands, it's a useless spell. Bloody Grasp deals spirit damage and an additional 100% damage against Darkspawn applied over 6 seconds, but it also drains 20 health from the caster immediately upon use. Vulnerability Hex or Affliction Hex increases damage, of course. The base spirit damage is the same as Arcane Bolt, however, so there is no reason to use this spell on non-Darkspawn enemies since you can just use Arcane Bolt, which doesn't drain your health. Against Darkspawn enemies, it can be fine, but you could also just cast a fire spell on them to do bonus damage. I think the idea behind these 2 spells is cool, that a Warden would use the power of their tainted blood to their advantage, but unfortunately, the Mage Power of Blood abilities at least are not really powerful enough to satisfy that fantasy, with Dark Sustenance being useless, and Bloody Grasp only may be worth casting on Darkspawn. Now that you know all the mage spells, let's talk about the official spell combinations present in the game. There are 10 such combos, and while some of them are combinations between spells only, some spells can have their combo effects triggered by other abilities too. Advanced Reanimation requires you to have Spellmight active when you cast Animate Dead. The level of the minion your mage summons will be higher, 90% of your level, which not only gives the minion extra health, but also grants it extra abilities. If you want to have a Necromancer type mage and you plan on using the skeleton minion often, I think this combo is absolutely worth it since it will make your skeleton far more useful and durable in combat. Entropic Death requires a target afflicted with Death Hex to enter the Death Cloud area, which dispels the Death Hex and deals a huge amount of spirit damage instantly. I think this huge amount of spirit damage is perfect to use on an elite enemy since it likely has a huge chance of killing them outright. Plus, the Death Cloud will also deal damage to other enemies nearby, so it isn't just used to cause the Entropic Death effect on one enemy. Grease Fire is caused by the combination of the Grease spell with any fire effect, whether Fireball, Inferno, or by an enemy on fire from Flame Blast, walking on a grease surface. Unfortunately, the Grease Fire barely does any damage over time, so it's just not worth casting. You're better off just casting multiple damaging AoE spells together. Flame Quencher is just a useless spell combination which allows you to put out a Grease Fire if you cast Blizzard on it. That's it. I don't know, it's possible that in some situations there may be a grease trap that you trigger that is then ignited by an enemy spellcaster with Fireball, or accidentally by one of your own mages, and in that case you'd want to quench the Grease Fire because it's not really to your benefit. But honestly, the damage from it is minimal, so even if it is affecting your own party members, you can just ignore it. Improved Drain requires for a target to be affected by a vulnerability hex, which will double the amount of damage and healing of the Drain life spell. Additionally, it will also cause the Mana Drain spell to steal 50% more mana. However, as I've discussed in the spell section, Mana Drain isn't all that useful since enemy spellcasters will only have a good amount of mana to steal at the beginning of a fight, and I'd much rather use Mana Clash on them to kill them outright if I'm going to do something that relates to their mana at all. Nightmare requires to cast both Sleep and Horror on a target, dealing a decently large amount of spirit damage instantly, removing the Sleep effect and applying the Horror effect. While it's a cool effect, the Entropic Death combo deals double the amount of spirit damage to an enemy and also isn't related to sleep effects that quite a few enemies are immune to. Paralysis Explosion requires casting a Glyph of Paralysis and Glyph of Repulsion on top of each other, causing all targets within 7.5 meters to be paralyzed for a long time. Be aware that friendly fire is possible, and if you and your party are too close when the spells combine, you and your party will be paralyzed, making you an easier target for incoming enemies. I've seen people talking about this combo and how strong it can be, but I personally find the potential downside of having my own party members paralyzed for such a long time too annoying, so I don't use it. Plus, generally speaking, you mostly want to CC a single target that is higher in priority, such as a spellcaster or elite, and if you have a swarm of weaker enemies, it's better to simply kill them with an AoE spell or use something like Cone of Cold or Blizzard to freeze them and give yourself and your party members a chance to shatter them. Speaking of, Shattering is my favorite spell combo and requires enemies who are frozen or petrified to be hit by Crushing Prison, Stone Fist, or a critical hit from a regular attack or any warrior or rogue talent that causes a critical hit. Enemies of elite rank and above can't be shattered, but regular enemies can, and so it's still a very useful effect to have access to, because even if enemies are of normal rank, some of them can be quite tanky and dangerous, such as the werewolves during Nature of the Beast. Shockwave is caused by the combination of Crushing Prison and Force Field. When these two spells interact, a shockwave is caused that deals physical damage in an area and knocks down all nearby targets. There is no effect on the primary target, other than immediately ending the effects of Force Field or Crushing Prison. Friendly fire is possible, and you can use this on friendly characters suffering from an enemy's Crushing Prison spell. However, do be careful when you do this, as the knockdown effect from Shockwave can't be resisted, so any of your party members who are nearby will suffer from it. Storm of the Century requires you to have Spell Might active and cast Blizzard and Tempest on top of each other. This effect drains the caster of an additional 100 mana when the final spell of the combination is cast. The storm lasts for 30 seconds, it deals a good amount of electricity damage every 2 seconds, and of course the electricity damage drains stamina equal to the damage dealt. Friendly fire is possible. Personally, I don't think this effect is worth it, especially as it will drain stamina from your own party members in the area. I'd much rather just have Blizzard going in the area to slow and possibly freeze enemies instead of just doing damage to them. If you want to do huge amounts of damage, you already have things like Mana Clash against spellcasters, Entropic Death against anyone, and disabling and damaging effects like Crushing Prison or Blood Wound and many other damaging spells. It's a cool looking spell combo for sure, but not really all that effective. These are the official spell combinations that are programmed in the game and that you also receive codex entries for when you first trigger them in a playthrough. However, I'd like you to keep in mind that many spells can be combined in advantageous ways, such as using Vulnerability or Affliction Hex on enemies so that you lower their elemental resistances, and then use a different spell or ability that deals a large amount of damage of a specific element that they become more vulnerable to. Any kind of spell that CCs an enemy, freezing, stunning, petrifying, or paralyzing them makes that target far more vulnerable to damage, seeing as they can't reposition or defend themselves while disabled in such a way. Buffing your tank's defenses, or your own if you're an Arcane Warrior, with multiple spells will obviously help them endure enemy attacks and abilities for longer. So even if you don't like any of the official spell combinations, you can still find ways to combine spells to your advantage in a way that fits your playstyle. Finally, now that we've discussed all of the stats, spells, and spell combinations, I will briefly give you a couple of gear recommendations. The most important things to keep in mind for regular mages are of course the attributes and other stats I mentioned in the stats section, and for Arcane Warriors and Blood Mages I mentioned a little bit extra when discussing the specializations themselves. However, there is a particular quirk of mage staves that I want to tell you about, so that you make an informed decision when you choose which staves to use. Other than the stats it offers, each mage staff also has a damage type associated with its basic attacks. This is relevant because in certain fights against enemies resistant or even immune to that damage type, you'll find that your mage's basic attacks are essentially useless. The worst damage type by far is Nature, because so many enemies are resistant or immune to it, and there are a few nature damage staves out there such as the Blackened Heartwood staff you can get during the Circle Mage origin. While doing basic attacks with your mage isn't the most potent thing in general, since spells are just much better, especially in the early game, it can be difficult to keep your mana topped up with good mana regen or lyrium potions, so there will be plenty of fights when you run out of mana and have to auto-attack with your staff while you wait for it to regenerate. Having a nature staff in these situations sucks. Personally, I recommend staves that do either physical damage, since those just have to deal with enemy armor, fire damage against darkspawn and undead, and cold damage against other types of enemies. Lightning damage staves don't suck by any means, but no enemy is really weak to lightning, so I prefer using the other damage types. I recommend having 2 or 3 staves on hand in case you see that your mage is doing no damage or very little damage with their attacks. In terms of armor pieces, keep in mind that you don't have to use mage restricted gear. You could use a light helmet instead of a cloth one if it has some decent stat like stamina regen, which turns into mana regen. And you could use non-mage gloves and boots if you don't feel like you need the stats of the mage-specific ones. In all honesty, sometimes for most of the game I don't even bother giving Morrigan anything other than basic light gloves and some defensive light boots, because even without amazing gear, mages are still absolute powerhouses. With this, we finally reached the end of my comprehensive guide to the mage class in Dragon Age Origins. This was an extremely long one, so if you've watched until the end, thank you. I really appreciate it. I think the mage class in DAO is quite overpowered, and perhaps a bit too complex in comparison to the other classes. Mages get 68 base spells, whereas warriors and rogues have far less interesting combinations of talents, since they just get 8 or 16 class-specific abilities, then have to specialize in one weapon style. Don't get me wrong, I love the fact that mages have such a large variety of spells and they're so much fun to play, but it feels a bit unfair that warriors and rogues didn't get an equal amount of love. What are your favorite mage spells and spell combinations or builds you like to use in Origins? I'm very curious to hear how you like to play mages since there's so many possibilities. Let me know down below. If you're looking forward to more videos about Dragon Age and other games I like, do remember to subscribe and leave a like and comment while you're at it too. They really help. A special thank you to my members who help keep this channel running. I'd really appreciate it if you consider joining the channel as a member to support me and unlock perks like early access to videos. This has been B Tier Mutineer. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.